Hello, dear devoted parents, carers and listeners. Today we are broadcasting the second in the podcast sub-series of The Mighty Quinn, called A Mother's Conversations with World-Leading Experts. And oh my goodness, do we have a wowzer of a world expert for you today. You'll need to be patient as I have quite an introduction for this formidable woman. 𝗟𝗲𝗍𝗆 is with us today, and with over 40 years experience in the field, she is one of, if not the, leading expert in the relationship between children's physical development, learning and behaviour, and within this, how to spot if there is a problem and then what to do about it. And by what to do about it, we are not talking about masking, medicating or managing symptoms, but true to our motivation and passion at the Brain Health Movement. I mean, to first analyse and understand what the root cause of the problem is, and then unblock them to allow our children to express their potential. As the director of INPP, which is the Institute for Neurophysiological Psychology, Sally has worked extensively with individual children and families in private practice and has developed a screening and intervention program for schools all around the world. She's written a brilliant array of books dealing with child development and specifically with neurodevelopmental delay, which we now refer to more as neurodevelopmental immaturity, renamed as such in recognition of our exciting development in neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to adapt and change. As far back as 2009, Sally described neurodevelopmental immaturity as encompassing many learning and developmental issues. How immaturity in the functioning of the nervous system can interfere with a child's progress across a range of tasks. Simply, Sally says, neurodevelopmental immaturity is when the brain and the body do not communicate well because of the continued presence or underdevelopment of a cluster of primitive reflexes beyond the first 6 to 12 months of postnatal life. And as we've discussed across a whole range of our information on the Brain Health Movement, neuromotor immaturity can block learning and be a physical factor in underachievement, in balance-related anxiety disorders, movement, behaviour, and emotional problems and dysregulation. And over these 40 years of research, Sally has been asking critical questions, such as, why is our children's physical basis or physical foundation so important for learning? How does neuromotor immaturity impact on learning, emotional well-being, and behaviour? How can this be identified and assessed? And what forms of remediation are possible with the inhibition of primitive reflexes, neuromotor training, sensory development, and of course all-important movement. And as many of our followers will know, I have seen an enormous transformation in Quinn through neuromotor maturity and primitive reflex focus work. So I am really looking forward to exploring with Sally the specific role she's seen in the development and understanding of neurological challenges such as ADHD, ASD, tics, dyslexia, and more. I have learnt so much from her extraordinary book, which I have here. It's my bedside reading, Reflexes, Movement, Learning and Behaviour, which I can thoroughly recommend to our listeners. But another of Sally's books, which I know she recommends above all others, is Raising Happy, Healthy Children. This book examines what children and babies really need, looking at the crucial early years from a child's perspective. So I'd like to segue right there to welcome you, Sally, to my mighty Quinn. Hello, how are you?
Hello, that's a kind of an introduction. So I'm very well and I'm delighted to be with you. And yes, I feel quite small, actually.
You're magnificent and we are so excited and privileged to have you. And I mentioned that book as an introduction because I think it's the perfect place to start, what children and babies really need. So Sally, may I start with, what do children and babies really need for healthy development?
We have the obvious things of shelter and warmth and nutrition and, of course, love. Love is the all-encompassing thing. But the thing that I think is often forgotten in our modern technological society is how important physical experience and social engagement is. That motor development takes place in the context of a social environment, of being able to explore your environment, to play, to move, whether it's at school, whether it's at home, and so on. and that we are part of the species of mammals, and all mammals have a basic underlying need to move and to play in order to grow up into healthy adolescents and adults. So in a society where movement opportunities for children are becoming more and more restricted, it's easier to put them in front of gadgets, to keep them mentally or cognitively amused. We are at risk of creating new generations of children with not underlying neurological disorders, but immaturity in their motor development as a result of socio-economic factors.
It's terrifying as a starting point, and yes, it's so prevalent. Is this why you would say we're seeing such an increase in children struggling in the classroom with these delays, with ADHD and the collection of symptoms around autism and so-called behavioural issues?
I think social factors are certainly contributing more than perhaps they did when I grew up, or my children who are now in their 40s were growing up. In as far as there is so much distraction in the general environment that it takes up to 15 minutes after our attention has been taken away from a task to get back into the same state of focused attention again. And as we know as adults, if you have pop-ups coming up on your screen when you're trying to focus on something, you find yourself getting more and more distracted. And our children's world is actually a cacophony of this now. It's not just TV as it used to be when, 20, 30 years ago. It's gadgets, it's devices, it's things pinging, it's things constantly challenging your ability to focus your attention on a single thing. We have those sort of things. We have the fact that life for parents, I think, has changed a lot in the last 30 years, that the sort of economics and politics means that more and more women, whether they want to or not, have to be in the workplace. That affects the course of their pregnancy in terms of the emotional stress that they undergo. It affects potentially how much time they spend with their child in the first 1 to 3 years of life. And although nursery care can be absolutely excellent and it can make up for deficits when there are parental problems, there are differences, subtle differences in that child's experience, how much one-to-one experience it has, how much conversation, individual social engagement, physical engagement, and so on. So it's very difficult to pinpoint any individual factor, but I just think the changes in modern life are potentially contributing to a growth in these type of, I'm not sure we should call them disorders. I think they are behaviours that are becoming more prevalent.
I quite agree. I quite agree with this disorders and what to call them. It's a very controversial area, but it feels to me so much like a collection of symptoms and behavioural struggles that are reflections of dysregulation, reflections of imbalance, reflections of immaturity. And with that comes hope, actually. With that comes, rather than receiving a diagnosis that your child has ADHD, there is an open door to explore what might be absent, what might be immature, what might need a little bit more support. And we are seeing change in these children. It's not a definitive diagnosis, which therefore means there's nothing that can be done. There is a lot that can be done when we come to understand what is really going on as far as the root cause is concerned. And with that, Sally, how do you think conventional medicine on the one hand and mainstream education, it's a huge question, on the other, is seeing the struggles that our children are facing? There's your qualified clinical empirical experience. What are they seeing this rise as?
I think the problem for medicine is that, certainly within the restrictions of, say, the health service in this country, is that their job is to look for pathology, is to look for something caused by disease and for which science has proved that there is an effective remedy. And if no clear pathology is present, in some ways that child or that family is no longer the problem of medicine. They become the problem of the other environments that they are functioning in, which in the case of most of the children we see is education. And so I call these children grey area children. They're not quite bad enough to have received a formal diagnosis. And if they have, it's not necessarily a diagnosis that falls neatly under the medical umbrella. If it does, it is often just in terms of assessment rather than intervention or treatment. And so they're passed over to education, where teachers these days have a very minimal education in their training on children's physical development and the role of physical development in supporting learning success, not learning potential, but actually achievement and learning outcomes. And so teachers recognize that there is a problem with a child, but they don't necessarily know what to do about it. They don't know how to identify what it is. And if they send it back to the medicine says, yes, we've had a look at this, but we can't find anything that we are going to work with either. And so these children simply fall through the net of services which should be in place to identify, assess, and then recommend effective remediation.
Yeah, that and therein begins another cycle, Sally. Formal medicine turns them away. It's not serious enough, or you're not sick enough. Education receives them and can't some of the behaviour that presents in class. And then you're left with this idea for many parents where each day they're collecting a badly behaved child, which in turn has another knock-on effect, affecting the child, affecting the parents, blame, guilt, where to apportion, was my child bad? And as we move on through this and we start to look at the impact of physical motor immaturity, primitive reflex retention in the classroom and how it actually can impact a child's behaviour, it just makes my heart bleed, because there's no such thing as a bad child. There is only ever circumstances which explain what is going on. No child intends to be a pain in the butt. It just isn't. I don't believe that's where we're at. So that's really what we're going to try and unpack together a little bit. So what in an ideal world, Sally, would these establishments need to do to support our children? How could the medical and the education establishment do this differently?
If we go back to the 1980s, all children at the time of Rising 5, just as they were going to school, all were assessed by a school medical officer who asked them to stand on one leg, hop to one end of the room, did a basic sight test and hearing test. And it was pretty primitive in terms of what they were looking at. And they would pick up some children with problems or some children who were just on the sort of borderline, again, the grey area children. But then they realised they didn't know what to do with the children who failed these preschool assessments. And so in their wisdom, they said, I know what we'll do. We'll phase out assessing these children. So whereas, what are we going back? 1980s. Gosh, we're going back nearly 50 years now. Whereas in those days, at least there was a recognition that this child may be entering school with some physical skills less mature than other children and that they should be kept under observation to see if things could be done. Now those children enter the school system with no clear picture of whether a child is physically ready or not. And so I know it's one of your later questions for me, but the whole area of physical readiness, again, is looking at outcomes and attainment of children at the time of school entry, not looking at do they have the physical equipment and the physical tools in place to be able to succeed and learn effectively in the classroom. And to go back to what you were talking about a little bit in the previous question, behaviour is language. If we do not have the verbal language with which to express ourselves, our needs, our frustrations, our overload or whatever, all of us, whether we're children or adults, will regress back to demonstrate that sense of insecurity in the way that we react, in the way that we behave. And behaviour in children is so often seen as something that must be removed because it's antisocial, it's inappropriate or whatever. Instead of asking the question, what is that behaviour actually doing for that child? Because behaviour is often a form of self-treatment, albeit so children who are constantly spinning are probably telling us something about the functioning of the balance or the vestibular system, which responds to different types of motion. And the type of stimulation they may be giving themselves may not be the right one to fix the underlying problem, but it's telling us that somewhere this system is not content. It's not happy. It wants something done that makes them feel better. And so in the whole area of behaviour, instead of saying we need to diagnose this child with a disorder, we need to put strategies in place to suppress behaviour, change behaviour, modify it or whatever, we need to be saying, what clue is that behaviour giving us? What do we need to look at to see if we can identify what underlies it? Are there things that we can do to help improve it? And if not, then maybe we have to look at things like behavioural modification, medication, and so on.
This is music to my ears, because I think it's all about root causes. And as our listeners will know from understanding my personal story with Quinn, I was being told constantly that this wiggle, this stim was something that was just, was okay. It was annoying and it was disruptive in class, but that it would go away. And if it didn't, that as opposed to being curious, why on earth would a child be moving this way? Why was the medical department, why was the educational department not asking this question? In fact, why weren't the teachers in Quinn's class asking why over a third of the class was having behavioural issues? Why aren't we asking why is the sort of drum that I've been beating? And yes, exactly this. And let's go back a little bit now, Sally, if we may, to school readiness, motor maturity, primitive reflexes. Could you talk to us about what you mean by motor maturity and school readiness? Can we go back to basics, please?
I suppose in a nutshell, motor maturity means that a child's motor skills are commensurate with expectations for their chronological age. For example, there is a window of what is considered to be generally normal for a child learning to walk unaided. Anything between about 11 and 14 months would be within the normal range. Going beyond that, it's getting a little bit late. Before that is a little bit early, which is always thought to be a good thing, but actually a child who's learnt to walk early may not have had quite as long as is ideal for things like crawling and creeping and putting other motor patterns in place to underpin later balance and coordination. So when we're looking at a child of, say, 7 years of age, we're looking to see, are the motor skills of that child up to this level we would expect for a child who is 7 years of age? And if they're not, then we can anticipate that there are going to be certain skills that are more difficult and more challenging for that child.
So there is an inextricable connection between the two, Sally, is what you're saying. And the brain is quite exact in the chronology. It's not a vague thing. If you missed crawling or you got to crawling too soon or too late, that is an indication of something that could have an implication for your learning later.
It can be. Very rarely is it one thing in isolation. So we use a developmental screening questionnaire before we ever see a family, and it has all sorts of questions on birth, pregnancy, family history, and then those motor skills development in the first years of life. And if a child scores more than 7 yes answers in the first part of that questionnaire, it's highly probable that if we then go on to see them and assess them, we will find that there are underlying problems with balance, coordination, possibly primitive reflexes, and so on. So it's rarely that you can look at a child and say one thing in isolation has caused something, unless it's severe oxygen deprivation at birth. It's more often a cluster of factors over a period of time that provide indicators that there have been little bits that have just gone a little bit sideways instead of straight ahead. And you can compensate for 1 or 2 things, but the higher the number of things, the harder it is to continue to compensate later on. And motor skills and postural control are so important because they provide the physical basis or the platform for centres involved in the control of eye movements, which are then going to support reading, writing, catching a ball, all those things that we assume a child will be able to do naturally later on.
Yes, and understanding the hierarchy. I'll often say it's a little bit like expecting the lights to go on in a house when you haven't put the electrical wiring in. Exactly. So there is a sense in which there is a very correct architectural build, and nature is formidable. The brain is formidable, and it does things in its own way to perfection. But if we interfere with certain milestones, or we've hurried through something, or certain stimulation hasn't happened and the neurosequencing hasn't quite been patterned as it needs to be, then it will have an effect on balance or eye convergence, and that in turn has an effect on reading or emotional regulation. So when you start to understand it in this way, once again, I think it presents an opportunity for us to go back. We know neuroplasticity is a proven thing. It gives us an opportunity to go back and, could we say, I like to say, re-hardwire or rebuild, or put some of those vehicles in place that might be missed or immature. Would that be a helpful way of...
software rather than hardwire, actually.
Software, yes.
But basic underlying neurology is your hardware that you're born with. But the experience that you have is the software that's put into that system and allows it to run any number of programs. And if that software has had pieces missing or is not linked up with something else, that lack of connectivity then can affect thinking skills, emotional regulation, how we feel about our world, how our sensory systems integrate to interpret the world, and so on.
It's amazing. And our motto is movement matters. And I would hazard a guess you would agree, and that movement plays a huge role. You're talking about the physical foundation, balance, convergence, and so forth, proprioception, all of these extraordinary component parts. As you say, it's never one, it's many that need to come together. But what happens, crudely speaking, Sally, if we don't move enough?
I suppose the best analogy is if you've broken a bone and your arm or your leg has been in a plaster cast. And if it's been in that for 6 weeks, when the plaster cast is taken off, there is some atrophy to the muscles. And if we think of the nervous system being like, it's not correct, but being like a muscle, if it's not used, it becomes slack, it becomes lazy. Sometimes the connectivity starts to just become redundant because it's not being used enough. And yes, as you've touched on, you can create alternative pathways. There is huge plasticity in how the brain can wire itself up. But if we don't use certain things, we quite literally lose them over time. So when I'm lecturing, I usually give the example of a little primitive creature called the Ascidian sea squirt, which when it's young moves around rather like a tadpole. But when it reaches what counts for adolescence in a sea squirt's life, it attaches itself to a rock and it continues to feed itself by filtering plankton that's passing in the water. But from the moment that it stops moving, it starts to consume its own primitive nervous system because it doesn't need it anymore. So it is a great reminder in the old adage that if you don't want to lose it, you need to keep using it. And that's not just true in old age. That's true from the moment that we are sort of, that we need to move. We were born to move in a gravity-based environment.
If you don't use it, you lose it. What's the name of that little creature again?
The Ascidian sea squirt.
The Ascidian sea squirt, God bless it. Yes, so that's a great analogy or metaphor for us to bear in mind. And we see it all the time, don't we, Sally? I was away a few months ago sitting on a holiday with a lovely couple, and they had their 2-year-old in a seat. And we must have sat with them for 2 or 3 hours chatting. And again, this is not about judgment. It's purely about education. They gave the little one a phone, and the little guy was absolutely absorbed with the phone, and it allowed them, of course, to have some downtime and to sit together. But I thought as the time was clocking on, I was child-free and enjoying being able to be child-free for that time. But as the time clocked on, I was thinking, my goodness, there was a time where that simply wouldn't have been possible. You've got this comfy seat and you've got this screen, and everything that child is missing out on, the sensory input, the smells, the tastes, the touch, the conversation, and of course, the movement. If you look at it in that regard, and then you think of if you don't use it, you lose it, and you think of how many hours our little ones are spending in car seats, or because we're in meetings, we put them down, but they're not making friends with the floor. They're sitting in a pram, in a whatever it is. For me, it was quite often a car seat that I take out of the car and then carry Quinn around in a car seat. And I think that's great. He's safe. But actually, it would have been far better had I been able to just let him roam around on the floor or go and eat some earth in the park. So that's what we're looking at in modern day, isn't it, Sally? That lack of movement, stimulation, integration.
It's not just about movement. It's also about conversation in real time. Anything that's on a device is pre-programmed, and it's been pre-programmed by a particular type of mind, what I call digital thinking, which is fine. It's wonderful. It's logical for all sorts of particular tasks. But it's not actually interested in what the child has to say, how the child reacts. It will continue to feed, to stimulate, but it doesn't adapt its response to what the child has
Right.
done in return. So it is not the same as having a real conversation with someone where everything is flexible and changes according to what's said back. And there's some wonderful work done at the University of Edinburgh by Colwyn Trevathan in cooperation with the Department of Music, where they were analysing mother-infant conversations. And they were able to show that if the mother was a receptive listener and she gave the baby time to process what she had just said, the baby would not only respond, but its response was the equivalent of a perfect musical answering phrase. The mother would go, "Linda," and if she waited, the baby would go, "Ah." And this would carry on for several minutes. But if the mother didn't wait, the baby would just give up and stop responding, as if to say,
Oh,
don't
my
you
word.
understand good manners of conversation? You need to wait for me and listen to me before you say something back. And we forget, I think, that when e-media is used, those elements are completely lost. That it'll go on firing because that's what it's been programmed to do, and it will fire a particular type of information, which is not the same as the intuitive, emotional, sensory information, which we rely on so much for good human communication. I was amazed when I did my psychology degree that up to 90% of effective communication is non-verbal. It's not what we say. It's how we deliver it. It's the eye contact. It's the tone of voice. It's the spaces we allow in between. It's knowing when there is the right comfortable social space for communication. And all of those things are derived from the knowledge and control, the vocabulary of your own body, what I call a physical vocabulary that feeds our non-verbal abilities to be able to communicate on a human level. And those don't exist on a flat screen. It's not the same process.
Oh, and it's so finessed and subtle and profoundly about connection, that we are losing connection. It's not just children who are affected as a result of the lack of those nuances, with children interrupting, not reading situations, all because of this, I'm sure. But we see adults as well. Adults have been affected with the way that we communicate with one another now. We don't sit down, we're not present with one another, looking at one another, we're on our screens, we have 300 other conversations going on at the same time. So it's quite a malaise across humankind now, isn't it?
And I couldn't give you evidence for it, but I would say since COVID, this is now an adult problem as well. That we find when we are arranging continuing professional development days, people don't commit to the days. They decide they're going to come the day before. They then tune out halfway through. That we all seem to be suffering from an information overload and an attention deficit, which is either causal or the effect of the information overload. In effect, we are becoming more and more like the children that we see as being disordered.
Absolutely. And our central nervous system regulation is so key to the systemic healing, which is something that we'll be exploring in future podcasts, Sally, and really wanting to talk about how important it is that we as parents address our connection with ourselves, our own regulation, if we're to expect that of our children. To wind back again, we've touched on primitive reflexes, and it's something that we talk about a lot within the brain health movement. And I'd love you, as just one of the world experts in this, as one of the contributing factors. Could we talk a little bit about, first of all, in your words, could you talk to us about primitive reflexes, and then we'll creep into primitive reflexes in the classroom and how they impact?
So every normal baby born at full term is born with a group of primitive reflexes that are there presumably to help it survive the first few weeks and months of life. So if you touch the palm of the hand, the thumb will come across, the fingers will grip, and it can't let go. If you stroke down one side of the face, the head will turn and the mouth will open as it starts to root or search for the breast or the bottle. So we all recognize these very primitive little stereotype reactions that every healthy baby should have. And they are active for about the first 6 months of postnatal life as connections from lower to higher centers in the brain are developing. So increasingly, the higher brain centers should be taking over control over the lower ones. And somewhere around 6 months of age, as these connections to higher centres are more developed, so the primitive reflexes slowly start to be put to sleep. The proper term is inhibited, but it's easier to understand them as being put to sleep because they never entirely desert us. Put to sleep in the brain stem. So if there was accident or injury to higher centres at a later date, they would pop out. So in situations like degenerative diseases such as multiple sclerosis, you will see the primitive reflexes start to re-emerge. In the progression of Alzheimer's disease, they will re-emerge in the reverse chronological order that they were put to sleep in the first year of life. So they've never gone away. They've simply been inhibited. And at the same time as they are being inhibited, so the brain should release what are called a group of postural reactions. And these are reactions that help us to keep the head in the correct position on the body, to adjust and change at a subconscious level to the needs of the environment when there is an alteration of position. And I describe that second group as being like a really good personal assistant to the executive part of the brain. If the postural reflexes are in place, the executive can float around the world doing all the things that executives do, and they know that all their basic paperwork and things or computer work will be done. If that PA is constantly taking days off, is not available or whatever, the poor old executive gets very stressed and exhausted. And this is like the effect of having underdeveloped postural reflexes and or persistent primitive reflexes on a child's cognitive, that they get overloaded more quickly because they're having to work harder at things. They don't always have the underlying physical support mechanisms in place. And therefore, it can potentially have an effect on behaviour and emotional regulation because you get greater stress, higher degrees of frustration and exhaustion. And just as we do as adults, when we're exhausted, we get bad-tempered, we start to use language we shouldn't do, and generally behave in ways that are not appropriate. If all has gone well, by 3.5 years of age, the postural reflexes should be fully in place. And in theory, from about 4 years of age, we should be able to assess the status of both sets of reflexes in a child to see are they at age level expectations. And if they are not necessarily the underlying cause of the problems, other problems you may be seeing, they simply provide reflections or signposts in maturity of the functioning of the nervous system. And as such, clinically, we use those as tools to show us, is there a problem? Are those reflexes pointing to problems in the functioning of specific sensory systems, such as balance, eye movements, audition, and so on? And if so, can we put together a physical program looking at the needs of the individual child, which will allow them to go back in time, repeat movements that they should have made at the appropriate time of development, and make those connections that hadn't been formed correctly the first time around? So that's how the INPP method, if you like, sees primitive reflexes. They are posts and tools, but as such, they also point us in the direction of what sort of remediation we want to use. And they also provide us with measures of change if what we've done has been effective. So I say to people, we expect to have your child on a program for around about a year, sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes a little bit less. You should not still be coming back to see me in 3 years' time, because if what we have done has not worked within that year, more of the same is not the solution. We are quite precise in how we use those reflexes as tools. It's not supposed to be an open-ended thing that is a lifetime's therapy. Our work, if it's being effective, you should be able to see change and measure it.
And again, how hopeful and wonderful is that? And it's indicative of the ability to teach again, to go back and remodel specifically. And there is a lot of research that is linking the reflections and the effects of retained primitive reflexes on learning struggles or behaviours in class. And I found it fascinating, particularly with Quinn, with these primitive reflexes do have the most horrible names, don't they, Sally? They're so unuser-friendly. But the ATNR, which is the asymmetric tonic neck reflex, the STNR and the spinal galant, sounds like a whole nother language, can have quite an extraordinary effect in the classroom. And I just wanted to explore that a little bit with you, as we have done with some of our doctors in the US, because when a child is moving around in class, it is not their fault. And I think it's a really important note to education, and really hoping that we can start breaking through with your programs into education to understand what is really going on for a child when a reflex or a postural reflex is immature or retained. Literally impacts how they sit, how when they move their head, what happens to their flexor muscles in their legs, when they move their arms when they're writing across the midline on their page. It solicits a movement that they can't help but express. Would you touch a little bit on that? Because I think it's so revelatory to understand these so-called ants in your pants and children labeled with ADHD and so forth, when actually there, in some cases, there is something quite simple going on.
Yes, there's a underlying mechanical problem. So if we take the one that you mentioned first, the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, all parents will remember this from when they were expecting their baby. So their baby's all curled up inside the womb like this. And mum starts to say the baby started to kick or to move. And baby's been moving for weeks before that. But the mother only becomes aware of it as the baby gets bigger and the movements become more defined and more robust. And what happens with this is when the baby tries to turn its head to one side, the arm and leg on that side try to straighten and the opposite one try to bend. So it's felt by mum as quite a powerful kicking or punching movement. And that reflex should get stronger through the remainder of pregnancy. It's thought to play a part in helping the baby to be born in a normal and natural vaginal delivery. And it's said to be the earliest hand-eye coordination hardwired into the brain at birth. Babies in the first few weeks of life are a little bit like me before I had my cataracts done. I've been incredibly short-sighted all my life. And my visual world used to end about here. And babies are the same in the first days. They can't really see anything much beyond here. And even that is not in clear focus. What they see are outside edges rather than central features and so on. And this little mechanism insists that when they turn their head, not only does the arm straighten, but the eyes are locked into the head movement. So the eyes are forced to go from near point focus to arm's length, and from central vision to peripheral vision and back. And a few days or weeks later, that hand may accidentally come into contact with a solid object. So gradually, through a combination of moving, touching, proprioceptive feedback, and seeing, the visual system starts to get an understanding of how far is that object away from me, how much do I have to move my eyes to actually reach for something over there, how do I adjust my visual attention from here to there, or from far distance to near distance, and so on. And this little reflex is just the very first lesson. But we shouldn't remain stuck on our first lesson forever. So when it's inhibited about 6 months of life, a lot of the visual skills have already matured by then. But if it still stays when that child goes to school and they are sitting at a desk to write, provided their head and hand is in the middle, there's no problem. But if they try to turn their head to one side to follow what the writing hand is doing, that's what the hand really wants to do. It wants to extend and it wants to open. And so this child has to find a way of controlling it. And there are all sorts of ways of doing it. You can hold it very tightly. You can use a really awful pencil grip. You can rotate your page so that you're in effect writing at an angle, or you can sit. But at the end of the day, the physical mechanics of writing never become an automatic process. So it can affect the quantity that a child can write. It can affect how the handwriting looks. Or it can affect their ability to transfer information from here down onto paper, because there is a mechanical interference in the process of getting it from here to there. So these are often the children who everyone recognizes. They're very bright, they're very verbally articulate, fantastic vocabulary. But when it comes to writing, they can write 2 or 3 lines, if that, and it doesn't reflect what they are clearly capable of. Yes.
Oh, it's so wonderful to hear this. Sorry, carry on, Sally.
So that's just one example. The other one you touched on, the symmetrical tonic neck reflex, is a response when the head is put forward, the top half of the body wants to bend and the lower half of the body wants to straight. If the head comes back, this part wants to straighten and the lower half wants to bend. And the effect of that is that the top and bottom sections of the body are never fully integrated when you are sitting. As long as your head's looking ahead, the reflex isn't activated. But if you look down to look at your work, this wants to bend. We end up virtually lying on the writing surface, and it's uncomfortable. So you can't sit still for long periods of time. And occupational therapists, physiotherapists will sometimes say, oh, there's poor truncal stability, there's poor core stability. We'll give this child a wobble cushion to sit on, because by doing this constantly, it'll strengthen the core muscles and they'll be able to sit still for longer. It does strengthen the core muscles, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem if the problem is coming from the neck downwards. And this is where the assessment is so important. I love that American phrase, we should never assume, because it makes an ass out of you and me. Very easy to say, oh, this child, maybe they've got reflexes, and perhaps they have, but we should always test. And if they haven't got that reflex, then a reflex inhibition program is not going to be the right answer. Maybe then the physio and the OT program of giving something that's going to improve the strength of core muscles is right. So there is no single right answer for any of these things. The key for me is to look at the child, see what that child's range of physical abilities are, and say, are there deficits? If so, where are they? Does what we have to offer address that? Or is it at a higher developmental level, in which case it should be going to somebody else?
Yes, it's really important to unpack and keep looking for those root causes. I think the exciting thing around the primitive reflexes, Sally, for me, is that I guess it was that in many respects for Quinn. And therefore, to see him I'm sure many parents are listening now and thinking, gosh, my son always ends up lying over the desk or turning sideways, and you think it's not just how they're trying to physically accommodate, but think of the stamina and the effort that could be better employed in just enjoying their lesson. But instead they are physically uncomfortable, they're restless. The spinal galant fascinated me as well, Sally, around how that can cause an irritation or an oversensitivity sometimes in the spine, and therefore the child literally can't sit back in the chair, or labels and clothes irritate. That's not just an agitation or simply that child's got ADHD. It is a central nervous system response when something is touching that area of the spine. And it, as I understand, it was very useful during the birth canal because it allows the child to flex and swerve down the birth canal as the sides are touched. But if it's not made or not inhibited later, it creates an oversensitivity or a mechanical immaturity, as you say. So it's just understanding little by little that there are a whole spectrum, cornucopia of reasons why our children are behaving this way, none of which are their fault. With the INPP method, could you talk to us about some of the success stories that you're experiencing with focusing on the whole portfolio of neuromotor development, primitive reflexes, vestibular, all the wonderful things you put together? Can we hear some stories?
It sounds awful. I always struggle with this because I think for so many years we have worked in the private sector that we have never used the stories that have come to us because it seems unethical to do it. It's not to advertise based on what. So I'm just going to try and drag some up from memory. There's one I've seen in the last couple of years, a child who was adopted, and as with many children who've been adopted in this country, the first 2 to 3 years of their life have been coloured completely by either neglect, abuse, or the things that really we would hope never happen to children. So this child had a terrible first 3 years of his life. He was seriously behind in all his sort of educational markers and so on, and difficulty with social relationships. So his reading age now is nearly up to where it would be expected. But the things that perhaps you can't quantify are things like that he was a member of Cubs, and for the first time he had the confidence and was selected to be the standard bearer for Remembrance Sunday and led the parade through the city on Remembrance Sunday. And these are things which I think for these children were unimaginable, perhaps 2 or 3 years ago. And I cannot say that what we have done is the sole reason why he was able to do this. The parents have also done a fantastic job alongside this in support. But I think what we do is enable something that was completely blocked before to start to become possible. And I think the first change I see in children is in self-confidence. Children who were unable to access things because there was mechanical difficulty suddenly get the confidence to try, find that they can succeed the first time, and then go on to try and try again. Whereas before, their experiences have always been ones of repeated failure, which then starts to result in avoidance of similar activities and situations in the past. Although parents often come to us with the aim of improving a child's reading or writing, and writing does generally improve, as does reading age, unless there are other reasons involved. But as far as I'm concerned, the most important thing is that physical competence and confidence, which enables them to go on and try and develop a whole host of other skills and activities that they wouldn't have done before. So I'm not avoiding individual cases, but I don't like pulling them out of the drawer very much.
I understand. It's a very important part of the picture. It's very easy, isn't it, to focus on educational accolades, reading, writing, as you say, but actually a child's confidence, a child's sense of self-worth, a child's feeling of belonging, all of which are so impacted by the former.
Yes, social relationships, being able to make friends, to keep friends, to feel that you belong in the world that you're going to live in, where so many of these children have always been on the sidelines before.
Yes.
So it's allowing them to participate and to be part of everything.
And this is where there needs to be convergence between the medical, the educational, the parental, and the support structures that we can offer. And I know that your program is hugely benefiting children in the public education setting. And how would you ideally see it dovetailing? How would you see your work and education coming together to address this, obviously with the support of parents at home? But how can we change our attitude within school?
In 1996, so it was a long time, I realised that what we were able to do in a clinical setting was very time and therapist intensive, and therefore we were only touching a handful of the children and families who needed something. And it was in an attempt to try and create a bridge that I thought, could we take out of our 2-hour assessment that we do with an individual child a few key tests that we could train teachers how to use, so that teachers could identify the children who have underlying physical factors in their presenting problems in the classroom. And then rather than tailoring a program to the individual needs of the assessment, as we would do here, put together a developmental movement program for a whole class of children to use under teacher supervision for 10 minutes a day for 1 academic year. So rather than teasing out this child needs this bit or this bit, we say we're going to start every child at the beginning of motor development in this class. They're going to do 6 weeks on 4 exercises. And then when the whole class can do that, they'll move on to the next batch of exercises and so on. And it will take them through motor development from 0 to about 1 year of age. So that program has been in various schools for, nearly 30 years now. We did extensive research on it in 2004 in a published study, which showed that the incidence of neuromotor immaturity in so-called mainstream schools amongst normal children was much, much higher than we had anticipated, and that those children who went through the program showed an improved neuromotor function at the end of the school year compared to others. Their drawing of the human figure, which is one measure of nonverbal cognitive performance, in many cases had improved by 2 years or more in a 9-month period. And those children for whom the program was designed, so they had already had more than 25% immaturity and underachievement at the outset, showed greater improvement in reading. So research has been done and is ongoing, and there are reports from individual schools from the last 20 years on our various websites showing what head teachers have said and so on. So that program was going quite well until COVID. And then this became impossible to do. And I'm not completely there yet, but I'm approaching retirement. I'm beyond retirement age, but I'm not fully retiring. It's a matter of actually training up a new generation to go into schools, to take this into schools, of which thankfully I have. I have somebody in Scotland who is going to take over part of my role with schools from this year. There never seems to be sufficient evidence to satisfy the critics, but I've been doing this for a long time. I hear my critics and I work very hard to try and address what they say, because I recognise that evidence is important. There are subsequent studies that have been done. There are studies ongoing in cooperation with universities in Poland, and there is a new international study starting looking at 3 reflexes in normal school-age children in New Zealand, Australia, Poland, hopefully the UK as well, and Spain. Because what we want to establish is what should be considered normal today for children's neuromotor skills. Because it looks as if there is a deterioration, that there are, as we said at the beginning, more children at an older age whose skills are less mature than they should be. And although medics will still say that primitive reflexes, if they persist, there has to be pathology, and if there's a pathology, there's nothing you can do about it. This research and previous research shows that a lesser degree of primitive reflexes does persist in the so-called normal mainstream population, that it does correlate with lower educational achievement irrespective of a child's intelligence. And what we want to establish now is what should be considered the normal for this. And if this is the normal distribution, should we actually consider it to be a normal distribution, or is it a reflection of changes in society that mean that children are simply less physically ready for the demands of the classroom than they were 20 years ago, 50 years ago, and so on?
And therefore expect to see more of the behavioural issues in the classroom, not less, if we're not given the opportunity to actually address them. So are we actually changing the paradigm, which is a horrendous thing to just accept? Let's just accept that this is the state of affairs, or the state of parenthood, or the state of our children, which I absolutely won't. You will have me cheerleading you, certainly not into retirement. You're not allowed to do that. There's far too much good work to be done, and far too much education still required. We haven't broken the critical mass of awareness until even 5% of the population know what neuromotor immaturity is, or until even a doctor, and I can say this, I know you can't, I can't tell you how many doctors I've mentioned primitive reflexes and they don't even know what they are. They don't know what, they don't. So there is a big job still to be done. And Sally, it's for us to hold hands, parents, with the medical community, with the educational community, and really understand that our children are not developing in a way that is healthful and allows them to realize their full potential. So with that, just what advice do you have for parents at the moment who are feeling overwhelmed and uncertain about their child's challenges, their behavior? What can you offer at the moment to parents listening?
I think there are 2 strands. I think there is what I call the orthodox mainstream strand, which should always be pursued first. If you are concerned about your child's coordination, you think there is a degree of ADHD, then you should go to your GP, and your GP hopefully will refer you to a paediatrician or to a child development team who can do the standard assessments. And if there is an underlying reason that can be treated medically, they will hopefully find it and they will offer you something. If you go through those processes and nothing is found, your waiting list is so long that it's going to be 3 years before you receive an assessment. As a parent, I would say then you have to start to pursue your own path, of which many of the organisations like yours, self-help, so much to provide an information source for parents as to what is around and where they can go. But it is still a bit of a lottery as to whether the one that looks good and looks really glossy and fantastic on screen is actually the best one. But I would say don't lose faith in your search. If you think your child needs help and your family needs help, then continue to try to find it by whatever means you can. Don't give up. Because I can't remember whether it was in our pre-recording chat or right at the very beginning, we were talking about how families often suffer from a sort of communal guilt or a sense of inadequacy. If there is one member who doesn't quite fit what is expected, that child either can become the scapegoat for the family's other problems, or else as parents we feel inadequate. There must be something wrong with our parenting, that we cannot make our child happy, we can't make our child succeed, and so on. And what this work does is to identify the mechanics of the underlying problem and show that it's nobody's fault. It's not the child's fault. They don't have the equipment they need. It wasn't the parents' fault. They didn't cause it willingly. But there are things that can be done to help make life easier. And that often alters relationships within the family as well, provided there's a flexibility. Sometimes it can be a problem if the child has been seen as the issue. The child is...
take that away. Yeah.
And then you're left with everything else. But generally, families do adapt to these changes, and it helps make life easier for everybody.
Yes, that's a very important point to reflect on, because I think certainly as a mother, I constantly feel I could have, should have, wish I'd known all the things I could have done better. And I think women particularly do tend to give themselves a good beating up over that. And the important thing to understand is today is a new day, and there is always something that we can do, and to remain curious, to remain hopeful, and for us as the Brain Health Movement to continue to have these privileged conversations with brilliant minds like yours who have led a life of devotion in understanding exactly what's going on with our children. And just, if you are waiting for a diagnosis, remain curious. If you receive a diagnosis, please remain curious. Please remain open-minded. There is so much that can be done beyond simply symptom management, or sometimes beyond medication too. It certainly is not a route that I have ever chosen to give into, if you like, with Quinn. And it is something that we have only seen the most magical benefits in understanding how to mature, balance, help his central nervous system. Really, I can only be here as a seat of love and encouragement, that there's so much possible. So what excites you, Sally, for the future? As a last note, what is here for us to look forward to?
If I could change trends that I see, I would say, as I did when I wrote Raising Happy, Healthy Children, we need to view children's development not from the perspective of adults or parents or cultures, but from the perspective of what are the universal biological needs of children to grow into healthy, happy children and adults. So what are the nutritional factors? Why do children need the physical engagement, the closeness that a child hopefully has with its mother in the first few months of life? Because that helps to nurture the nonverbal understanding of feeling, empathy for other people's emotions, and so on. Understanding that as a species of mammals, we need to be engaged in rough and tumble play to help understand and develop social boundaries, to look at physical readiness, the whole child's readiness for education, to find a way of identifying that, which is, I think, partly what we've done with the school program. It was one of the aims with the school program, was to screen children as they come in and identify those with greater physical needs and look at putting a physical program into place. And recognizing that results, educational results, are the outcome of having been put through a tunnel of an educational system. And before a child goes into that tunnel, we need to look at, is the equipment in place? And if it isn't, what does that individual child need? And that's not just in terms of physical intervention programs. It's looking at how teaching is targeted at a child, saying, it's no good just teaching the same thing over and over again. If a child doesn't understand it, we need to ask, where is that level of child's understanding in this subject, in this area? And we need to go back to where he is and start to teach from there upwards, instead of starting from here and assuming that somehow miraculously this child is going to come up to reach us. So I suppose it's looking at development, putting development back into every part of preschool, care, parental care, child development, and then again into education for teenagers who are the parents of the future, about what do children really need, will need from them when they become parents to grow up into the sort of children they hope they can be.
There's a thought. Our teenagers are the parents of the future, indeed. And I'm hearing loud and clear, Sally, and thank you so much for not just the science and the passion and the dedication and the research, but the connection, the reminder of how important our human connection and engagement is, and that readiness is all.
Yes.
Readiness is readiness for life and readiness for school, readiness, preparation, solid foundations, understanding from that perspective, as opposed to being so outcome driven, so gratification driven. It's very much about coming back to a quieter, stiller space and understanding how we can breathe into this and slow down.
So
thank you.
I have a logo, a brain, which is like the top of the tree. And although the brain directs everything, unless the top of the tree has a secure trunk and roots in place, which is where it's come from, that brain is never going, or that tree is never going to flourish properly. And that's how I see our children and education and life, really.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is an absolute jewel in the crown of our offering to our parents. Just in conclusion, besides love and boundaries, freedom to move and freedom to play, freedom to connect are the most important gifts that parents can give to their children. And in Sally's book, which I thoroughly encourage you to read, Raising Happy, Healthy Children, she's showing how a baby's relationship with its mother has a lasting and deep impact. We've looked at how recent social changes, delayed motherhood, juggling work-life balance, stress, rubbish diet, limited uptake of breastfeeding, use of parent substitute baby equipment, electronic devices, all these things are interfering with some of the key developmental milestones that are essential for well-being in later life. But I just want to finish on some words of Sally's that I read. We need a society that gives children their parents, and most of all values motherhood in the early years. So let's just remember that, our connection, our huge power of presence, to be present with our children, to be connected to our children, to put down the phones, to switch off the televisions, and really be as a family. Thank you so much, Sally. Lots of love.
Bye-bye.